Well, good evening and welcome to the CAF webinar for this evening. Joining us is Stephen Bridgewater, and a little change of pace tonight because of the time difference. He is in England, and of course we're in the States in the central time zone, so we're recording this in advance. So there may be a little incongruity here and there as we talk about things that are happening. Actually, one of the things that's just happened is that they had snow where Stephen lives, so I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, Stephen is the editor of AOPA-UK Magazine, and he's also an author. He's writing a book that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And as always, if you have any questions during the broadcast, even though this is being recorded, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and Stephen will probably log back in when we do air this and be able to answer you in real time. All right. So again, if you have questions, just go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we'll see if we can get you an answer. All right. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Steve Bridgewater. Welcome, and looking forward to your presentation. This is one of the more interesting titles I've ever seen for a presentation, however.
Thank you, Steve. It's an interesting story, and I've been blessed in my career now. I've been an aviation journalist for just over 2 decades, and I've been able to do some fun stuff, and I'd like to take you on a couple of journeys and the places I've been and the things I've seen. I think in the next hour or so, we will head over to Moscow, to the Moscow Air Show, and we'll do Oshkosh, and maybe a couple of surprises along the way. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the CAF. As you'll see as I go through, it's an organisation very close to my heart, even on this side of the pond. So it's a great privilege. As Steve said, I am the new editor of AOPA-UK Magazine. We actually went to print with our first issue about 45 minutes ago. So this has been a big day. I'm running on adrenaline right now, and speaking to the CAF is just the pinnacle of that day. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope you enjoy what we're about to do. So I thought we'd start with a little bit of history. I know you Americans love our British history, so I thought you might like to see where this lecture is coming from. Look. This is where I live. This is a village in Derbyshire, and it is called Dale Abbey. Now, you see at the bottom of the screen there, what looks like a very big window is in fact a very big window. This village was first colonised back in 900 AD. At that point, it was called Deep Dale. And there was a baker in the nearby city of Derby who had a visitation from the Mother Mary and was told to go and live as a hermit in Deep Dale. And that's what he did. He lived in a cave. The cave is still here. You can walk up into the cave. There's an altar carved into the wall of the cave. And over time, the local landowner kept on him. They brought him food, kept him warm. And in time, a church was built. From the church, there became the abbey that you see the remnants of there. That abbey dates from 1162 AD, survived until 1539, when that lovely King Henry VIII decided, through the disillusionment of the monasteries, to knock them all down so that he could get his own way. But what is the remnants of that abbey? And a lot of the houses in the village, we've got about 30 houses in the village, and very importantly, a village pub. A lot of the village houses are built from stone that has been reclaimed from that abbey. So the other thing of interest, you may well have heard the stories of Robin Hood. Robin Hood and his merry men. Well, figure in the Robin Hood stories was the Sheriff of Nottingham. Well, the nearest city to us here is the city of Nottingham. There was a character in Robin Hood called Alan of Dale. In fact, there was a particular story called The Wedding of Alan of Dale. Well, guess what? That's the abbey where Alan of Dale got married, if you believe the stories. So I'm going to apologise now. You may hear a little bit of barking in the background. These are my 2 companions when I write. They're sitting down at the foot of my desk at the moment. The reason I mention this is because they do have an aviation link as well. They are both named after famous pilots who were both heroes of mine. Franklin, our black dog, you see there, he's a black poodle with a white tuxedo stripe. He is named after Jimmy Franklin, the airshow pilot. And the white dog is called Howie, and he is named after Howie Keefe, the famous owner and racer of Miss America, the P-51 Mustang. So that's who keeps me busy while I'm sitting ploughing away at my keyboard and writing. So I'm going to briefly touch on my CV. I got into writing when I was very young, 25 years old. Top left magazine, Air Action, was a magazine aimed at getting kids involved in aviation. Not just flying, we concentrated on all sorts of careers and hobbies. And from there, I went through the GA world with a magazine called Today's Pilot, did lots of air show programs that you can see there. Ended up on the editorial team of Pilot, and then launched a magazine called Go Flying, which is the one at the bottom right. Had a bit of a career break to go and do non-writey things, and did some freelance writing, which you can see there, including two on the bottom there. You can see Guild News and the Air Pilot. Those are magazines I'm still involved in now. The Guild News became the Air Pilot, and that is the magazine for the Honourable Company of Air Pilots, which I will talk about a little later on. More recent writing, top left, you can see that picture of Concorde against the Union flag. That was a magazine called that we produced, and that was focused on the jet warbird movement and stories of vintage jets when they're in service. And there are some of the books and bookazines that I have done in recent times, including a book on the Lightning. Everybody in Britain loves the English Electric Lightning. We've done books on the Vietnam Air War, the Korean Air War. And down at the bottom there, you can see we did a Warbird directory a couple of years ago, which was a list of all the UK Warbirds, whether they were airworthy or under restoration. And this is what I've been doing recently. Steve alluded to the most recent book I've done. It is Aircraft of the Royal Air Force, in which we list all 596 types of aeroplane that the RAF has operated since it was formed in 1918. Lots of features in there as well, but we've got a chronological list along the bottom with a photograph of each of those types. And on the left, you can see the Air Pilot. That is the latest issue of the Honourable Company of Air Pilots magazine, of which I'm deputy editor. And top right, as of 45 minutes ago, that is my first front cover for my new job as the editor of AOPA-UK Magazine. So, as I say, very proud day today. So, for me, started at a very young age. Now, I only put this photograph in just to prove that I did once have hair, I guess. For me, it was petrolhead. My parents were into sports cars and speedboats and water skiing, and I think I inherited that petrolhead gene at a young age. I also developed a love of aviation at a very young age. This was 1984, so that would put me at 9 years old there. That's at the aerospace as was at the Royal Air Force station at Cosford. Nobody knows why I liked aeroplanes. There's no family history, but my first word was aeroplane. Like so many of us, my passion started at a small scale with radio-controlled aeroplanes. I'm 11, I think, in those. As I got older, the aeroplanes got bigger, and as you can see, the hair got longer as well. The good mullets there at the top right. Bit of 80s power ballad, I think. Aviation took over from models to real aeroplanes. 1988, I had my first flight in a small aeroplane with a family friend. That's a Bolko Junior. Although it's on a German register, you can see the D registration. It was actually based in the UK at the time. And that's my dad, my dear departed dad on the left in the red coat. We lost my father last year. He had dementia for a number of years, and we sadly lost him in 2020. But it was through my dad that I got my first real taste of flying. This was my first small aeroplane flight. I would eventually go on to fly solo. The advantage of being an aviation journalist is there's always a photographer with you. So that is actually my first solo back in 2003. But it all dates back to this day in 1986 when I was 11. And my father paid for me to have a flight in this DC-3 Dakota. And this is something that creates train through my entire aviation life and career. This was Aerobatic company at Coventry Airport that did pleasure flying in DC-3s, amongst other things with DC-3s. My parents couldn't afford for all of us to go flying, so my parents sent me on my own. I remember the day distinctly. It was miserable, it was cold, it was wet, it was low cloud. We sat around in the airport terminal that smelled of cigarette smoke and vinegar on French fries. I can still, to this day, picture the smells and the sounds of the day. And then eventually the weather cleared, we went flying, and we skirted the bottom of the clouds for half an hour. And it was something that ignited my passion. To say, I the last year, and this is a painting that I commissioned in his memory. It now hangs above my desk here in my office. I'm looking at it right now as I speak to you, and it's my way of, when I'm writing, when I'm having a hard day, I look at the picture and think all the opportunities that my parents gave me. I was very, very lucky to be blessed with parents who gave me lots of opportunities. Perhaps none is more important than this first taste of aviation. This was Coventry Airport. This was also Coventry Airport. I'd done various air shows as a kid, but this was my first Warbird show. It just grabbed me. All of a sudden, I knew where this passion lay. My passion lay in vintage aeroplanes. What have we got here? We've got Helen Tempest on the wing of the Stearman there, top right. Helen's actually a good friend now, would you believe, 30 odd years later. The P-51 Mustang, Missy Wong from Hong Kong, she was in the Empire of the Sun film. The Catalina, that bottom right there is Charles Church's two-seat Spitfire. What else have we got? P-40 Warhawk, that was Stephen Gray's P-40. That aeroplane's out in the States now. That's Lulu Bell, which recently returned to the US. French B-17, the TBM Avenger, which is now down in Australia. Pit Special. I just had this fascination for aeroplanes. You know, King Cobra, P-4, all these aeroplanes that I'd read about in books, I was now seeing. Now, why do I mention this one air show? For one very, very good reason. It was organised by the CAF. This was the first and to date the only air show organised in Britain by the CAF. It was by the Douglas Bader Wing. It was August 1988. So I think, like so many of you, I have the CAF to answer for creating this drive and this love of vintage aviation that I have. So I worked my way through school. I was at university, building radio-controlled aeroplanes still, and there was a letter in the local newspaper. This man had just bought a Tiger Moth. And I thought, you know what? I'd like to build a Tiger Moth, radio-controlled one. So I wrote to him, and he invited me up to go and have a look at his aeroplane. And he said, well, you know, we're actually having a fly-in this coming weekend. Why don't you bring your model aeroplanes up? And when there's nobody flying them with their real aeroplanes, you can do some flying, entertain people. So I got some friends together and we did that. And at the event, this aeroplane flew in, which was a Pit Special. It was owned by an aerobatic display pilot called Denny Dobson. And I was asked to do some commentary on the event. Gift of the gab. 19-year-old, full of self-confidence. Up I got to do it. I got a phone call on the Monday asking me if I'd like to go and be the display team's commentator, their announcer. So I spent many happy years in my late teens and early 20s going around the airshow scene, but not just air shows, around country fairs and carnivals, wherever the aerobatic aeroplanes were, I was doing the announcing. And this stood me in great stead because I would ultimately see an advert in a magazine asking for a deputy editor. And I thought, you know what, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I'll apply. And I went for a job interview and sat down opposite a magazine editor who went, I recognise you. You were the kid that was commentating and announcing at the show at Baxterley. And that really helped me get my first full-time writing job. And that was 21 years ago. So again, just one letter as a reasonably shy teenager was what stemmed a lot of this. And since then, I've travelled the world. I've been very lucky to have a job which has enabled me to go to some amazing places. This is in Switzerland, at Basel. My first trip to the US was in 2001. I went to Fort Lauderdale for the, would you believe, the AOPA convention, which seems quite apt now that I've just taken over editing the AOPA magazine. And this was a great event. We actually got to the aeroplanes through downtown Fort Lauderdale on the way to the convention center. Just a great experience. But, you know, how about we go somewhere a bit more exotic? You guys know this thing, yeah? The States, for me, as a 25, 26-year-old, was exotic. but I think you guys are probably used to the States. So how about we go behind the Iron Curtain? How about we go to Moscow? This was 2001. This was actually my first assignment as an aviation journalist overseas, was to go to the Moscow Air Show at Zhukovsky. A great event. There's the big Antonov 225. No barriers anywhere, just surrounded by people. The reason I put this photograph in is quite specific. If you look on the left, you can see a young lad in camouflage fatigues, and you see behind him several more. They were not the crowd line, they were behind the crowd, and that was to stop you pointing your cameras in the wrong direction. If you were seen to be photographing any of the aeroplanes parked behind them, they would quite happily remove your camera, take the film out, because this was pre-digital days, and give you your camera back without the film. There were aeroplanes the Russians were not happy for you to photograph, even though this was a public event. Russia was a really interesting experience. You've got these wonderful fountains and gold top buildings, and they stretch for about half a mile from the center of Moscow or any of the big cities, and then you're into tower blocks. It really was, this was 2001, a culture of them and us. Those that had got a lot had a lot. Those that didn't have a lot really had nothing. And it was a real eye-opener for me to experience post-Glasnost, post-communist Russia. But the good thing about Russia then, and I think still today, is they don't throw aeroplanes away. You wander around airfields and you can understand why so many warbirds have been found out in the tundra or all sorts of places, you know, in lakes. Russians have just been, these things have been pushed into trees, and we might need that one day. So this is an airfield called Kaluga, where there were Yaks, this is Yak 52, there were Yak 18s, all sorts of things around, and just some MiG-21s that were parked up there just in case they might need them one day. In the hangar, this is a PZL Vilga, which was a, it's used for all sorts of things. It's essentially a training aeroplane, liaison aeroplane, but used for target towing and banner towing and glider tugs and that kind of thing. Really interesting aeroplane. But I was there to go to the air show, so that's what we did. This was Tupolev 154, which was a recently refurbished airliner they were trying to sell at the show. Behind that is a flanker, Sukhoi 27 flanker, one of the Beriev flying boats. There was some really interesting stuff. But at the time, I was working for a private flying magazine. So although the jets were really interesting, things like this really fascinated me. This is called a T-101. It's called a Grash, which means rook. And it was designed as a turboprop replacement for the Antonov 2, you know, the big AN-2 biplane. This was designed as a replacement for that. We only built 3 of them, so just proves a bit like the DC-3 that the AN-2 is pretty hard to replace. The Russian Knights, Su-27 flankers, whizzing around the sky. It was a really interesting place to be. And then you see aeroplanes like that, which I don't know what that is. You know, I'm reasonably well versed in aeroplane. You know, I've been reading magazines since I was a kid. But what the heck is that? That is a Yak. It's a Yakovlev UT-2, NATO reporting name Mink, and it was designed as a replacement for the Polikarpov PO-2, which you may know, the big Polikarpov biplane, which I think there are a few of flying in the States. We've certainly got one over here in the UK. So you'd be perhaps think, well, maybe it didn't catch on. I know the PO-2. Well, it did catch on because the Russians built 7,243 of them. I'd never heard of it. To the best of my knowledge, there are only 2 known to survive. But who knows what's lurking in the back of a hangar in Russia somewhere. This, another Yak, the more modern one at the time, this is the Yak 54 competition aerobatic aeroplane, and developed from the Yak 55. You may remember the Yak 110 doing the airshow rounds at the moment, the 2 Yak 55s strapped together with a jet engine between. Well, this is the 2-seat version of that Yak 55. This is the Yak 54. And one of the highlights of the trip was to go to an airfield called Chkalovsky. Now, Chkalovsky is also known as Space City. And if you can read on the side of the aeroplane there, it says the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center. This is the Russian equivalent of the Vomit Comet, you know, the zero-G training aeroplane. This was the Russian equivalent. So, having been to Russia, let's go back to the States. This was 2003, and this was my first taste of the Mecca, which is Oshkosh AirVenture. This is not the best picture, but it emphasizes my point. I was there with my best mate, Andy, and we got there on the first day, and we walked into this main, which at the time was called Aeroshell Square. It's now Phillips 66 Boulevard or something like that nowadays, I think. And we went, oh my gosh, look, there's an Airbus Beluga. Oh, there's a U-2. There's an F-18. There's a Tomcat. And everywhere we looked, we were like the proverbial kid in the candy store, aeroplanes that we'd never seen and always dreamt of seeing. I mean, just looking here, I mean, I don't know when you can see my mouse move, but there's the Super Corsair there up above the DC-10, Tomcat in front of it, Phantom. This is the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, which is now in the Smithsonian. The Mats Constellation. Below that there, that's the Red-tailed P-51, the CAF P-51C. First time I'd seen a high-backed Mustang. I was just in heaven. But the aeroplane that really grabbed my attention was just up here, just off the throat, as they call it, that little red and white aeroplane, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Just a nice picture, really. That's the Stratoliner in the sunset at Oshkosh, and one of my abiding the show was seeing that with the warm sun glistening on it. My other memory was this, which was an air-to-air photo sortie we did. This aeroplane's called a Gippsland Airbag. It was designed and built in Australia, hence the VH registration, and this was the company demo aeroplane. Now, my editor at today's pilot, Dave Unwin, had done a flight test on this, and as his deputy editor, he said, if you're at the show, can you get some photographs of the aeroplane, because we need some pictures to illustrate it and hopefully put it on the front cover of the magazine. So we arranged this. I was flying in the back of a T6. If anybody's been to Oshkosh, they'll know it's a big site. The T6 was taking off from Warbirds, at the far end of the airfield, and this aeroplane, the Airvan, was taking off from where you saw it briefly there on the throat at Crowd Centre. Now, what I wanted to do, there's me in the back of the T6. I wanted to get a photograph of the aeroplane because if you can see here, on the side, it's got a big sliding door, a bit like a van, with, you know, the Ford Transit type van that we have in the UK. I guess you call it the Transit as well. And what in our mind's eye, we've got a headline that said the Gippsland Airvan. It does exactly what it says on the fin. So we wanted the shot with the door open, which we did, and we got that shot there. And it was really cool because that's my buddy Andy. And if we zoom in, you can actually see he's reading our magazine in the back of the aeroplane. So really cool experience flying over Lake Winnebago at sunset. Got some lovely pictures, went on the front cover of the magazine. Andy got some good shots of me in the T6. Everything was good. Now, this is the bit where we get to, if you remember the first line on my first slide was how I nearly killed my best friend. Well, that was this day. It was July 2003, and Andy was the best friend in question. We had taken off, as you say, with the Airvan and the T6 at two separate parts of the airfield. The T6 got delayed in traffic. We were behind a load of Warbirds trying to get airborne. So the Airvan was up holding over the lake for about 45 minutes, waiting for us to get there. Now, when we landed, Andy was white. The colour had drained from his face. And it took at least 3 beers until he could tell me what was going on. And he went, well, I was sitting with the door open because it was a nice warm evening. And all of a sudden the nose dropped and the aeroplane built up speed. And he said, did you know an Airvan was aerobatic? And the demo pilot, who got a prospective purchaser in the right-hand seat, decided to barrel roll the aeroplane with the door open. Andy lost his bottle of water over the side. He managed to grab his camera bag. I've just got visions of somebody rowing across Lake Winnebago with a 2-litre bottle of water coming whistling through the bottom of their boat. It was, to this day, which is nearly 20 years later, Andy hasn't let me forget the day I nearly killed him. So, where should we go from America? How about back to the UK? And this was the day that Andy got his own back on me, shall we say. This was a year later. I'd gone to an airfield called Wrencombe, which is a World War I airfield, beautiful all grass, circular airfield, take off and land into wind, absolutely beautiful. Famous for its steermans, and also famous for being home to the UK's wing walking team. And this was the day, having gone there to fly the steerman, I ended up also flying on the steerman. Sponsored at the time by Utterly Butterly, which was a sort of a margarine spread. I don't know whether you got Utterly Butterly in the US, but over here it was a butter replacement, easily spreadable margarine. So there I am on the top of the aeroplane, waving frantically. And my photographer at the time, a guy called Steve Fletcher, who's sadly no longer with us and very, very much missed, said to me, I tell you what, Steve, try and sort of look nonchalant, look like it's really easy. So there I am, legs crossed, arms behind my head, looking really nonchalant, which is all well and good until the aeroplane gets up to about 110 knots. And then you try and get your arms and your legs back to where they were. My memory of this flight was looking across at the camera ship, which was a J3 Cub, with Fletch, my photographer, with tears of laughter running down his cheeks when he realised I'd managed to get myself stuck on top of the wing. Having said that, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Absolutely loved it. So, where to now? How about Romania? Anybody been to Romania? That's another interesting ex-communist Eastern Bloc country. The aeroplanes you can see there, they're extra 300s, as I'm sure you know, and they are part of the Romanian national display team called the Romanian Stars. And they were based at an airfield called Tuzla. Now, I was in Romania to help run an event called AeroGP. AeroGP was, if you imagine the Red Bull Air Races with the time trials, AeroGP was similar, but we had 6 aeroplanes on the course at the time racing around. So it was a very intense sport. It tended to take place in Eastern Europe, where the legislation was a little more lax, shall we say. So my job for this event, having been to a previous one in Slovenia as a journalist, was to come out to Romania and to work effectively as the ground boss for the event. The racing took place off the coast. This was a town called Constanta, which is on the Black Sea, very popular tourist destination with wealthy Russians. So I took a couple of photographs I thought you might like here, this is the view from my office window. Lineup of AN2s. It was a bit of a culture shock on my first morning, where I was handed the keys to the airport building and the office, and the airport manager disappeared for the rest of the week and left us to it. I was given the choice of any AN2 I wanted to fly, but I didn't really fancy that. Even less, this is a crop sprayer. This is a helicopter Kaman, Russian-designed, jet-powered crop spraying helicopter with contra-rotating rotors. Really interesting insect-like looking machine. Now, the reason I wanted to show this was, if you can see the recently cut grass behind there, that was cut especially for our event. And it was a real eye-opener when I went to walk out on the field to see how things were going, to see the guys were cutting the grass with a scythe by hand. They were walking behind a donkey, which had got a car they were putting the cut grass on, and they were cutting the grass with a scythe. This was a real culture shock, especially when we then went to our hotel in downtown Constanta, where the car park was full of Ferraris and Bugattis and all sorts of exotic sports cars. And it was on about day 3 that I said to my translator, where does the money come from? Where have these people got the money where other people haven't? And the very simple answer was, their parents were big in old Russia. And I thought, I don't need to know anymore. So this was another aeroplane we had use of. This was used generally as a camera ship and as a runaround. This is another of those Vilgas, the Pisa Vilga, with its knock-kneed undercarriage. Also thought that would make a really interesting radio-controlled aeroplane. Here's the lineup of AN2s that I had the choice of. I didn't fancy the yellow one at the end. They were doing an engine change on the middle of the airfield, and it didn't look like an entirely sterile environment as far as I was concerned. But we were there to organise an air race. It was AeroGP. Now, Jeff Zoltman, that organised the race, it was the brainchild of AeroGP and Flying Aces. He played a blinder because he'd managed to get the show sponsored, and sponsored by various companies, including the Playboy channel. So we got some interesting viewing figures, I think. Yeah, probably enough said about that. I think there are so many confessions for an aviation journalist that probably should stay in the computer. This is what we were there to do. We were racing over the sea, as I said. This was two of the extras. That's Peter Pudlansek in the far-off aeroplane, DPP, and Zoltán Veres from Hungary in the one nearest to us. I managed to do quite a bit of flying while I was out there. This was an aeroplane called a Harman Rocket, which was one of our race aeroplanes. And part of the event was simulated dogfights, effectively, with lasers to try and shoot down your opposition. So it was very much a show business type event. And this was taken just to show you what the crowd line looked like. We were down on that beach just there. You can see the extra there pulling away from us as we've just shot him down. This again is Peter in the Slovenian registered extra. Now, normally when I do air-to-air photo sorties, like we've done with the Airvan and everything else that I've shot over the years, I try and carefully organise the events, thoroughly briefed, everybody knows what they're doing. But just occasionally, a sortie comes together that you weren't planning. And this was a late evening. We were heading out from Tuzla, which was the airfield that we were at, to Constanta, to the racecourse, just to do a late evening recce so that all the pilots could see the waypoints and see exactly where we were going. So I'm in the Harman Rocket. They're being flown by Smokey Young. Peter joined us on the wing with the extra. Beautiful, got some really nice pictures. And then the formation started to build. So Andy Bickmore there in the Sukhoi. And then below him, Mark Jeffries from the UK in his extra. Jerry Cooper in the CAF, Zoltán Zoli in the other extra. And it just built into the most beautiful light, the most beautiful positioning, and one of those impromptu air-to-air sorties that just sticks with you. Really, really good fun. And on the way back, we got some beautiful light as well. So I thought you might like to see Zoli in the sunset as we head back in over eastern Romania, just off the Black Sea coast. Single seat extra, that one, that's the 300S that Zoli was flying at the time. Now, I said we flew in Romania. It was an interesting environment in terms of legislation. As you can see there are people out in the sea underneath the flight line. That's one of the AN2s doing a recce down the flight line. This really struck me when I had a meeting in the office back at Tuzla with the head of the Romanian equivalent of the FAA. Now, I thought this was going to be a difficult meeting. There were a few of us sat around a board meeting in this room full of cigar smoke. And my task, because I've got TV crew with me, was to set up something really interesting for the TV crew. It was a channel over here we've got in the UK called Channel 5, the show called The Gadget Show, and they were testing new digital camcorders, and they wanted to do something really cool. So I had the idea that what we would do is we would fly at very low level over the town square in Constanta, and therefore we could have the camcorders on the ground filming the aeroplanes, and we'd have the aeroplanes, videos in the aeroplanes filming the town as they flew over the top. And I thought, this is going to break a lot of rules, and we're going to need permission from the FAA. So I put the proposal to him, and there was silence for about a minute while he thought about what he wanted to do. And he took another big puff on his cigar, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Steve, I do not see a problem with this. However, I think it is very boring. I have a better idea. We have a bridge." Yes, they did. He said, "Why don't you fly under the bridge?" So that's what we did. We flew our high-performance aerobatic aeroplanes under the bridge in downtown Constanta. You can see some of the camcorders. In fact, I think that's me there in that blue top there actually filming it. and various film crew and people around. That's the two-seat Sukhoi 29 going under the bridge, and that's the picture I took. If you imagine, you just see me on the ground, that's the viewpoint that I had at the time. That's the Su-26 going under the bridge. And that's got one of the film crew in the front seat. But you know what pilots are like. It's a bit like herding cats. If one does it, they all want to do it. So Andy did a couple of runs, and then everybody else started, including the Romanian guys in their Yak-52 tail draggers. It was a really interesting experience, but I'm not sure. Could you imagine in the US going to the FAA and saying, we've got a really good idea, we'd like to fly under the Potomac Bridge? Don't think it's going to happen.
I don't think so.
And of course, Zolly had to go one better and do it inverted.
Sure.
Just absolutely one of those moments that you pinch yourself and go, did I really manage to negotiate that? And you go, no, I didn't actually. It was offered to me on a plate. So that was Romania. Now, I mentioned at the start that very first aeroplane flight I had in that DC-3 was from an airfield called Coventry. That very first Warbird air show, that Wings of Victory CAF show, was at Coventry. Now, it's perhaps serendipity that I ended up working at Coventry Airport. I went to university at Coventry University. I started volunteering at an airline called Air Atlantique. You may remember was the airline that operated that DC-3 back when I was 11 years old. So one of my first jobs as a volunteer while I was at university was to rebuild this aeroplane. Now, I think there's probably most British aviation enthusiasts couldn't tell you what that is, so I'm not going to do a spot check with most of you. I'm just going to tell you that aeroplane is called a Percival Prentice. That's what it looks like when it's finished. It's also an awful aeroplane. This was a typical British idea. We like to do things differently over here. You know, it was a bit like when the world created the VHS video format, the British created the Betamax, which was completely different, but we just did it our own way. Training aeroplanes, generally two-seat aeroplanes, side by side or tandem, that wasn't good enough for the Brits. This is a 5-seat training aeroplane. And the rationale was, instructor would sit in the right-hand seat, student would sit in the left-hand seat, and 3 of his mates would sit in the back and learn from the mistakes he made. Now, that aeroplane is a 5-seater. It's all metal. It's got a 251 horsepower Gypsy engine. That's a lot of aeroplane for 250 horse. Yeah, it's the only training aeroplane that the Royal Air Force ever had that wasn't aerobatic. And it was pretty much generally hated by most people that flew it. However, it has an important story to tell. And we at Air Atlantique decided to restore one for that very reason. And it was useful for pleasure flying because it had 5 seats. So it was a good money-making aeroplane for our historic flight. Interestingly, the orange glass that you can see on the canopy there, that was for night training. To simulate night flying, the student would be given a set of goggles with a tinted glass that glass colour reacted with the orange and created the illusion of flying at night. So, Air Atlantique, famous for our DC-3s. This, again, is Golf Alpha Mike, Romeo Alpha, Gamera. This is the aeroplane that I took my very first flight in at the age of 11. And here it is outside the hangar. The hangars were full of DC-3s while I was volunteering there. At one point, we had 12, and we had the contract for pollution control works. So if there was an oil slick, if an oil tanker ran aground somewhere off the British coast, we had the contract to go and spray dispersant on that oil. And the DC-3 was the aeroplane that we chose. There were occasions when we needed a bigger aeroplane, and we used one of our 2 DC-6s, seen here, spraying over the sea. So there's a fleet of our DACs. This, again, is one of those serendipity moments. I'm now volunteering at Air Atlantique. I'm at university, so I would be 20, something like that. Friday before our air show, we've decided during the air show we're going to put up a flight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 DC-3s. And that's all well and good. They need moving. So Friday afternoon, our chief engineer says to me, Steve, can you come and give me a hand? I need some help taxiing the DC-3s across the airfield. So bearing in mind I'm 20, I've not learnt to fly yet. I've got very little experience of being in big aeroplanes. So he sits me in the left-hand seat and he talks me through getting a big round engine started, which is great. That's brilliant. Gives me a checklist. And we get one started and he talks me through it. We taxi across the airfield. This is brilliant. We come back, get a minibus back across the airfield. And he said, right then, Steve, I'll take this one. You take that one. I went, I'm sorry? He went, well, I've just checked you out. You can taxi a DC-3. So I'm now 20 years old with no pilot's license, strapping myself into the left-hand seat of a DC-3. And guess what? It's Golf Alpha Mike Romeo Alpha, that aeroplane that I flew in as a passenger when I was 11 years old. That, for me, that sent a message. That was really, really special. That was a great day, really, really great day. I've got great memories of my time volunteering at Air Atlantique. And many years later, in 2009, I ended up being the commercial operations director for the Air Atlantique Classic Flight. So if anybody asks you, point in volunteering, well, I started volunteering and I ended up as the commercial director. So it leads somewhere. We had a fantastic fleet of aeroplanes, including 2 of these de Havilland Dragon Rapide biplanes, which we use for pleasure flying. And during my time as commercial director, I was tasked with a group of others of setting up our museum. What had happened, while we had a profitable airline, our chairman had spent money collecting vintage aeroplanes. These might have been Dragon Rapides like this, or the DC-6, or it might have been Gloucester Meteor. We had 2 Gloucester Meteors. We had 2 de Havilland Vampires. We had 2 Venoms. What else did we have? Gosh, 2 Jet Provosts. Percival Pembroke and Avro Anson, all sorts of eclectic 1950s aeroplanes. And the rationale was we wouldn't collect Spitfires or P-51s because lots of people were collecting those. We would collect the aeroplanes that were falling through the gaps. But like that Percival Prentice had a story to tell. They might not be the best aeroplanes in the world, but they played a vital role in developing aviation. So we created what was called Airbase. And this was our museum, which we opened in April of 2010. Great facility. And one of the aeroplanes that I was particularly responsible for was our Nimrod. Now, if anybody doesn't know what a Nimrod is, it is developed from the de Havilland Comet, the jetliner, and this was effectively the British equivalent, if you like, of the P-3 Orion. US Navy had the P-3. We had the Nimrod for anti-submarine type work and search and rescue, that kind of thing. Now, I was sitting in the office one day and I had a Facebook message from a friend who worked at Rolls-Royce who said, Steve, you know the Air Force are retiring the Nimrods? Well, yes. He went, well, there's one spare. I don't suppose you want one. So I said, well, I doubt it very much because we collect flying aeroplanes and there's no way we could keep a Nimrod flying, but I'll ask the chairman. So I went in, sat down with the chairman, and he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, let's open the negotiation and just see what the plan is. I mean, I have no idea what a Nimrod's going to cost. So I phoned Royal Air Force Kinloss, managed to get through to the base commander, would you believe? And he went, yeah, Steve, we'd love you to have an aeroplane. We know you would keep it live. It would be running. It might not fly, but at least it would keep taxiing around, keep it as a tribute to the people who flew and maintained these aeroplanes. However, we can't sell you the aeroplane. You have to go through the Ministry of Defence and through something which is called the Defence Disposals Agency. And they're charged with getting their pound of flesh, basically, for selling it off. So he gave me the number for Defence Disposals, and I phoned them, got the man on the end of the phone, told him the story, and he said, yeah, more than happy. He said, as long as you can give us more than the scrap man will pay for the aeroplane, you can have it. I said, brilliant. I said, I don't mean to be cheeky, but what's the scrap value on a Nimrod? I've got no idea. And he said, well, we think it's about £15,000. I said, 50? He said, no, 15, £15,000. That struck me as quite cheap for a big lump of metal. So I went and sat with the chairman again, and he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, you should never accept the first offer. I said, I'm going to make an offer and see where we go. So I faxed my offer across, days of fax machines. I faxed my offer across to the Defence Disposals Agency and didn't hear any more. Until 2 months later, when I had a phone call from Squadron Leader Roxy Roxburgh, couldn't be any more British, really, could you, than Roxy Roxburgh, saying, hello, Steve, I'm just wondering what time you want your Nimrod delivering. It's all well and good, Roxy, but I haven't actually done a deal yet. Oh, you'd better come up to Kinloss and have lunch. So a few of us flew up to RAF Kinloss, which is right up in the north of Scotland, and we sat down at the base commander's office, took us out for a very nice lunch, and he said, right, here's the way this is going to work. We will deliver the aeroplane to you next Tuesday, at which point we will take off various bits of the aeroplane that we need, because at this point, the Royal Air Force was supposed to be replacing the Nimrod with a newer version of the Nimrod. So there were bits that were compatible that they were going to recycle. For example, would you believe they were going to take the windscreen wiper blades to put onto the new Nimrod as a cost-saving exercise? He said, by the time the aeroplane's been there 3 days, we'll have stripped out what we need. I will give you the keys on the logbooks. He went, at that point, the aeroplane will not be flyable. If you've still not done a deal, well, possession's 9/10 of the law. So I wasn't entirely convinced about this, but seeing as it wasn't my idea, I decided to go with it. And sure enough, the following Tuesday, XV232, Nimrod MR2 landed at Coventry. Now, 232 is a really interesting aeroplane. This aeroplane served during the Falklands campaign in 1982, and Falkland Islands, obviously down in the South Atlantic. This aeroplane held the record at the time for the longest Royal Air Force mission in history. And while the British were recapturing the Falkland Islands, XV232 was flying up and down off the Argentinian coast, just the presence to say, we're here, don't send anything else out. It's interesting, if you look at the logbook for 232, 2 days after that flight, it went into the hangar for a modification. We call it sort of a Heath Robinson modification, which enabled it to carry Sidewinder missiles. Now, these Sidewinder missiles were mounted under the wing, and they were actually fired through a piece of piano wire, which led its way all the way up to the cockpit. That's how Heath Robinson was. But you can imagine the guys coming back from that 22-hour mission, being constantly lit up by Argentinian radar, saying, I'm not going back there until you give me something to defend myself with. So, sure enough, 232 landed in April 2010. There's a happy me. As my best friend, who you remember I nearly threw out of an air van over Oshkosh, eventually said, it's got the face only a mother could like and a double bubble fuselage. He said, I'm not saying whether I'm talking about you or the aeroplane, Steve. So I think that's his revenge for the Oshkosh incident. Andy, you've got your one up at last. So we got XV232. About 2 months later, I got an invoice in the post for £15,000. At which point I phoned Defence Disposals Agency, and that's all said, that's all well and good, but I only offered you 5k. So would you believe we bought a nuclear-capable maritime patrol strike and bomber aeroplane with 17 tons of fuel on board for £5,000. I think that's what you call your tax dollars at work, ladies and gentlemen. I just put that one in there. That's, as I'm sure you could tell, I was very close to my father, and this was the day he came in to see 232 with his dog there. That was Max the Labrador. And I remember my dad saying that was one of his proudest moments. So I just wanted to include that photograph just for my benefit more than anything else. That was Airbase. That was our hangar. So you can see there we've got two Venoms outside the hangar door, a red and white Jet Provost, two English Electric Canberras, there are DC-6 there. At the back of the hangar there's our Pembroke, one of our de Havilland Doves, DC-3 here, the red one, that's the other DC-6. So it was a really eclectic mix of aeroplanes, and it was a great fun job to have. I was there for a couple of years and thoroughly enjoyed it. So we get on now to another of my proud moments, and again, a little bit of British history that you may not be aware of. This is me in 2018 receiving the freedom of the City of London, which is a huge, huge honour to receive. In 2006, I was invited to become a member of the Guild of Air Pilots and Air Navigators, or GAPAN. Now, guilds are a very British thing. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with a guild. The earliest record of a guild in Britain is in 1155, which was when the Royal Charter was granted to the Guild of Weavers. Now, I'm going to give you a brief bit of history just to put it into context, but go back to 1067. 1066, Battle of Hastings. 1067, William the Conqueror. Now, he knew, this is a year after, he knew that the City of London, not Greater London, the city, what's now the financial district of London, even back then, 1,000 years ago, had huge financial and political power. And he knew that he couldn't conquer that part of the country. He needed it on his side. So instead, he set about trying to win over the Saxon Londoners with some concessions. And what he did is he granted a special charter that gave that square mile, what's now called the London Square Mile, the freedom in its own trade and the right to self-government. So what that square mile, what the London city did, was set up guilds in order to trade within the walls of the city. So if you made goods or sold goods, you needed to be part of a guild in order to sell them within the city. So there was a guild of cutlers for the people that made cutlery. There was the guild of leather makers, the guild of fishmongers, all that kind of thing. Now, only members of those guilds could serve trades within the city walls. In turn, they provided welfare for their members and provided, in effect, a retirement. So they would look after the elderly fishmongers when they could no longer trade. So it was very much a sense of well-being, both material and spiritually, I guess. Now, back in medieval times, the usual way to enter a guild was through an apprenticeship. You'd spend 7 years serving your master. So there'd be, let's say, a master fishmonger. You would serve as an apprentice for 7 years, at which point you'd then be granted your freedom. Now, freedom meant quite literally that you were a free man. You were free to trade within the city. You were free to work for anybody or to set up your own business. Now, this was a big thing in medieval times. Freemen eventually were elevated to the livery. You take the livery, and that meant that you had more, and you were then able to set up your own business within the city. So freemen can work for anybody. A liveryman could set up his own business within the city. Now, back in the 13th century, effectively, having the freedom was a license to make money, quite literally a license to make money. You had a piece of paper in your hand that said you could sell your wares, you could sell your services, but in order to do it, you had to be a member of that guild. So the other perk of being a guild was if you were a member of that guild, you had to sell products that were at a certain quality. So in effect, it was a bit like trading standards are nowadays. You know, if you sold mouldy fish, you were no longer welcome in the guild. So what would happen in that instance is you were banished from the City of London, and you were banished to the second best city in London. Now, where is that city, you may ask? That city is Coventry. Coventry, where Eric Lentique are based, where I went to university, where I took my first aeroplane ride. We have a phrase in the UK, I'm not sure whether it translates into the US, but if you're ignoring somebody, you send them to Coventry. And that is the origins of that term. You're being banished to a far off land superior to London. Seems pretty apt. So anyway, guilds continued until about the 18th, 19th century, and the Victorians decided to get away with this. Now, they decided it was a cartel, it wasn't to be done, and the guilds, in order to maintain their survival, went into a new role, which was providing charitable work. They'd already worked in charities looking after their own people, but now they became organisations looking after the needy, effectively. And this created a revival in companies, in guilds, including, would you believe, the Guild of Air Pilots. We were formed in 1929, so it was 26 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. I joined the Guild as an associate in 2006, which is the modern day equivalent of being an apprentice. So having served my years as an associate, I then became a freeman of the Guild. In 2018, I was honoured to be invited to take the livery. Now, in order to become a liveryman of the Guild of Air Pilots, you need to first become a member, have the freedom of the City of London. And this is what you see in front of you here. This is my wife, Nia, and myself in the Guildhall in London, having just made my declaration to the Queen and to the Mayor of London, where I said, I do solemnly declare that I will be good and true to our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, that I will be obedient to the Mayor of this city, that I will maintain the franchise and customs thereof, and will keep this city harmless, in that which it means that I will also keep the Queen's peace in my own person, that I will know of no gatherings nor conspiracies made against the Queen's peace, but I will warn the Mayor thereof or hinder it to my power, and that all these points and articles I will well and truly keep, according to the laws and customs of the city to my power. It's a very antiquated phraseology, and it's one of the things in life which is a wonderful honour to have, but is not terribly useful in modern day society, if that makes sense. It's a great sense of achievement. It's wonderful to be recognised and accepted. It's interesting, the Guild of Air Pilots and Air Navigators is no longer the Guild. In 2014, the Queen actually granted us honourable status. A royal charter was presented upon us by Prince Philip, our patron, the Duke of Edinburgh, and we are now formally the Honourable Company of Air Pilots, incorporating air navigators. Honourable pilots. I'm sure we're all honourable pilots. So what does the freedom mean? What does it actually mean in modern day terms? Well, there are a number of dubious privileges. As a freeman of the City of London, if I am hanged for treason or murder within the walls of the City of London, I'm entitled to a silk rope, which I'm sure is a lot more comfortable than a normal type of rope. I am allowed to walk around the city with an unsheathed sword in order to defend myself from pickpockets. I don't think I'm going to try that one. Technically, I suppose it might still be legal, but with armed police in London nowadays, I don't think I intend to walk around with an unsheathed sword. Now, apparently, freemen, such as myself, are allowed to be drunk and disorderly without fear of arrest. In fact, instead of arresting me, the police officer who finds me drunk and disorderly within the City of London is duty bound to not only put me in a black cab and send me home, but to pay for that cab as well. Again, I'm not sure I'm really going to push my luck and try that one for real. But what you see in front of you here is something I do thoroughly intend on trying. One of the big privileges back in medieval days, as a freeman, you were entitled to drive your sheep across London Bridge, which at the time was the main way in and out of the city. So today, we are still, as freemen, entitled to drive our sheep across London Bridge. And this is something that happens once a year. The various guilds get together, and it's done as a charity event, raising money for charity. And it's something that I thoroughly intend to do. My wife is a doctor, but she's actually a farmer's daughter. So we have our own sheep. We have about 300 sheep back on the farm in Wales. I did inquire, but apparently they need to be Metropolitan Police vetted and approved sheep. Did you believe, or could you believe, there is such thing as a Metropolitan Police approved sheep? There you are. So, there I am, receiving my liveryman's clasp from our master at the time, Colin Cox, who was a 747 pilot for Cathay Pacific Airlines. Today, we are company number 81 in the listing of honourable companies and guilds. There are actually 110 guilds modern day. The most one was the Worshipful Scholars. There's also the Worshipful Company of IT Consultants. But of course, the very first ones, the first 48, are the really, really old ones that date back to the 1500s. And there was some debate for quite a while over the order of precedence as to who was first, second, third, etc. Now, the Lord Mayor in 1515 decided who sat where in that order. The problem came when he reached the merchant tailors and the skinners, so the leather makers. They were founded within a couple of days of each other, and nobody could decide who was the oldest of the guilds. So the decision was made that they would share 6th and 7th positions, and they would swap every year. So the tailors would be 6th one year and the skinners would be 7th, and then the following year the skinners would be 6th and the tailors would be 7th. Now, as you can imagine, this caused all sorts of confusion, and this reportedly is where we get the phrase, when we're all confused, that we're all at 6s and 8s, 6s and 7s. So that's another minor little bit of British influence into the modern day language that goes back to the 1500s. But being a member of the Guild and the Honourable Company is a hugely important part of my life now. I'm now the deputy editor of the Air Pilot, which is our magazine, and we get to meet some fascinating people. This is my wife and myself at a dinner a couple of years ago. Later on this evening, we were back at the Royal Air Force Club having a brief gin and tonic in the club. It may have got to about 3 o'clock in the morning. I can't remember. It's all a bit blurry now, if I'm perfectly honest. And Nia wandered back across from the bar with a distinguished-looking elderly gentleman on her arm, high heels in her hand, glass of champagne in one hand, and she said, "Steve, this is my friend James. Would you like..." James used to fly jets, you know. So I stood very much to attention and said, "Commander Lovell, Apollo 13, it's lovely to meet you, sir." You fascinating and wonderful people. And my wife had spent an hour and a half at the bar talking to Jim Lovell without actually realising she was speaking to Jim Lovell. So
amazing.
One thing that Leah asked me to talk about on this specifically was my favourite air show venue. And I'm conscious that time is ticking. I'm going to whistle through a couple of slides of my favourite air show venue. And that is it. Anybody recognise the venue? The venue is the Shuttleworth collection. It's an airfield in Old Warden in Bedfordshire, beautiful central England, and it is home to the Shuttleworth collection. Richard Shuttleworth can probably be considered as the founder of the British Warbird movement. He started collecting ex-military aeroplanes in the 1930s, and today it's one of the most fantastic venues to photograph aeroplanes. So we've got things like this Bristol M1, which is a modern day replica but built to authentic plans. An original Royal Air Force SE-5A from 1918 with confirmed victory on the day before the armistice on November the 10th, 1918. An original 1918 Avro 504 with a rotary engine. An original Bristol fighter. This is an original Sopwith pup, but it's not. The Sopwith pup, that perhaps the most famous of British World War I fighters, the last 10 built two-seaters. They were converted on the line. They were built as pups, converted into two-seaters and called Sopwith Doves. This was a Sopwith Dove. It was bought by Richard Shuttleworth in the 1930s and returned into that Sopwith pup fighter configuration. If you're wondering what a Dove looks like, that's the Dove. This is a replica of a Sopwith Dove, but with an original engine and again built to the original blueprints. A Sopwith triplane. This is not a replica and not an original. This aeroplane was built to the original plans with an original engine, all the original techniques, and it was constructed shortly before Tommy Sopwith passed away at the age, I think, of 101. He saw the aeroplane and he decreed that it was a late production Sopwith triplane. It was so accurate. People that built that also built this Sopwith Camel. The Northern Aircraft Workshops is the name of the group. Then there are visiting aeroplanes such as this Royal Air Force Factory B2. So it's a wonderful, wonderful venue for World War I aeroplanes. Also for 1920s and 30s air racers. This is a pair of Percival Mugulls. The white aeroplane used to belong to Alex Henshaw, very famous racing aeroplane that broke the London to Cape Town speed record in 1939, a record that stood for more than 70 years. Miles Hawke Speed 6. Again, there is only one place in the world where you will see these aeroplanes, particularly this, perhaps the most famous of racers in Britain, perhaps the most sexiest of racers that Britain's ever designed, the de Havilland Comet, winner of the London to Australia air race in 1934. Still flying today, 70, 80 years later. And there, the four of them together, the two Mugals, the Hawke Speed 6 and the Comet. A Compass Swift air racing aeroplane in the 20s. A lot of the Shuttleworth shows take place in the evening, so you get some beautiful low light. This is a Chiltern DW1, 32 horsepower that thing races on. Gets over 100 knots on 32 horsepower. A visiting aeroplane, a Miles Whitley Strait. You know, the de Havilland Dragon Rapide there in that glorious evening weather. We even let the Americans come to play, you know. Spartan executive departing after one of the shows. You've perhaps heard of a Tiger Moth. This is a de Havilland Moth. Not just any moth, it's the oldest surviving moth. A really important aeroplane, a pre-production aeroplane, and built in 1925, still flying today. This aeroplane, EBWD, a Hermes Moth, DH-60 Hermes Moth. This has a really interesting world record. This is the aeroplane that Richard Shuttleworth learned to fly in 1932. It's been based at Old Warden since 1933, 89 years on the same based airfield. It used to live in that barn that you can see behind it there. De Havilland 51, DH-51. The Parnell Elf, which was designed as a competitor to the Moths. Too expensive, couldn't compete, but instead of flying wires, you can see it's got those big interplane struts, almost like girders. The Dezuta, an aerial taxi of the 1930s. A Hawker Tomtit, training aeroplane from the 1930s Royal Air Force. Often flies in company with these two. The Avro Tutor with the Sunburst, and the de Havilland Tiger Moth with the checkers on top of its wing. The Tutor, the only survivor of its type, the same as the Tomtit you just saw. A Miles Magister, monoplane trainer, introduced just before World War II. But what were they training people to fly? Well, this was another trainer. This was the Blackburn B2, side-by-side trainer. And they were teaching people to fly aeroplanes like this, the Gloucester Gladiator. Or the Hawker Demon, that beautiful Hawker line that you can see translated right into the Hurricane. Take the top wing off, you've almost got a Hawker Hurricane fuselage and tail. Sometimes they get visitors. This is two Hawker Nimrods from Duxford that have come to play, one of the Flying Navy shows, there with the Demon. Westland Lysander, famous for landing behind enemy lines, dropping off and picking up special agents under the cover of darkness. Avro Anson, this is a post-war aeroplane. Sometimes they let other aeroplanes land on airfield. It was recently been extended, so we can now get aeroplanes like the Corsair. This is the fighter collection, Corsair Duxford. Came in for the Flying Navy show a couple of years ago. But Shuttleworth have their own World War II aeroplanes. Mark V Spitfire, you can see there, a Hawker Sea Hurricane. That Spitfire, built in 1941, that aeroplane actually escorted the Memphis Belle on some of its sorties. This is a really, really historic aeroplane. You can see it's got clipped wings. It was one of the low altitude Mark Vs, which had the wings clipped to improve the roll rate. And you can see the light starting to fade. Aeroplanes are coming in at the end of the day. Most air shows, it's time to go home. But at Shuttleworth, it's time to get out the Edwardians. This, an Avro triplane, 1911 design, built for the film Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. It's a replica, but again, to the original specifications effectively. Same as this, a Bristol box kite replica from the film Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. Seeing the two pootling around at sunset. Quite often they say it could only be at Shuttleworth. and then moving from the replicas to the originals. This is a 1911 Deperdussin. Original aeroplane hops down the runway. Same as this, an original Blériot, 1909 Blériot, the oldest aeroplane flying anywhere in the world. Restricted to hops, but it does fly. Now this is really special. This is only flown by the chief pilot. This is the oldest British aeroplane still flying. It's a 1912 Blackburn monoplane, sometimes called the Blackburn Mercury. Not only does this hop, it flies, and it flies beautifully. It's such an incredible thing to look at and realize this is nearly 110 years old, flying around in the sunset at an airfield in Bedfordshire. But some of you know that because we had a very famous visitor fairly recently to Shuttleworth, and I thought you might, just to finish, you might like a little bit of familiarity. So, taking off from Old Warden, That's All Brother. So, with That's All Brother, I guess that's all from me. But I'll be, with the time difference, obviously this is being recorded, I'm going to have some sleep deprivation for you. I'm going to stay up until the small hours, and I think we're going to have a watch party. So if anybody's got any questions, please fire them away, and I'll try and answer as best I can for you.
Well, that's great. Steve, with just a couple of minutes before we wrap up here, how many hours of flight time do you have in your logbook now?
Oh, that's a good question. I stopped flying myself about 10 years ago. I voluntarily handed my medical back. I have a spinal condition, which means I'm prone to very sudden headaches. So I've probably got a couple of hundred hours logged, but a heck of a lot more time in the right-hand seat of aeroplanes, from classic jets through to DC-3s. And one of my most memorable trips, I didn't obviously have a lot of time to cover everything in this speech, but when I was a volunteer at Air Atlantique, I got a right-hand seat trip in the DC-6. And we came back low level from Liverpool. We'd been to John Lennon Airfield to record a TV commercial. And I realized that we were going to fly over my parents' house. So we were so low that my cell phone worked. And I phoned my parents, told them to go and stand in the garden. And my parents' house at the time was quite prominent. It was on the end of a row of houses on the brow of a hill, and we could really spot it. So we dropped the flaps, came in, and just as we went over the top of my parents' chimney, we went to max takeoff power and rocked the wings. And apparently the whole street came out, and my mother was saying, "I'm sorry, it's Stephen again. I'm sorry, everybody." So yeah, I've been very, very lucky. I've got to fly in some really interesting types, and I often say I'm very lucky. I don't have a job. I have a hobby I get paid for. But you know what? It's better than a real job.
That is a very true statement. And with that, we will close this evening. Steve, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. As you said, you're going to hang around in the chat for a little bit yet to answer any questions people have, and hopefully we're talking about this offline. And you're hoping to get back to Oshkosh this year if the show comes off. And after seeing the pictures of Shuttleworth, it just reinforces that for an American, that's one of the shows that I certainly want to get to sometime. It's on my bucket list.
Well, it's certainly the beauty of Shuttleworth is we've managed to have air shows at Shuttleworth this year. It's such a small venue that you can watch the flying from your car. So we've actually had drive-in air shows, like going to the drive-in cinema. The airfield is a natural amphitheatre, so you park your car. You have a 5-metre square box, and you have your picnic, and it's very civilized, that British kind of way. Everybody brings a picnic, you sit at your car, and you watch the flying. But yeah, you're right. I'm really looking forward to getting back to EAA this year. It will be my 10th visit this year, hopefully. And having missed 2020, I'm getting withdrawal symptoms. So yes, I'm really hoping that we can have a show of some description in 2021.
I hope so too. Steve, again, thank you for spending time with us tonight. And again, the chat room is open. And as always, we appreciate you spending some time with us on our webinars for Wednesday night. I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.